see that it's somewhat flat to increasing, and if it's increasing, that's not a good thing for our business, right? That means you're just spending too much from an OPEX to generate the same amount of revenue. And then if we look a little bit further and look at the profit divided by revenue, we see it declining somewhat, right? So we're in a situation that is somewhat not sustainable, right? And now we're talking about things like network slicing, which we'll talk a little bit further. And what concerns me is that we need to fix this imbalance here before we can solve this issue, right? And you need to have things like automation, you know, some type of open source. And when I say open source, I put that with an asterisk. It's commercialized open source, right? Because I've seen some people go too heavy on open source and realize, like, I don't have the capability to support this, right? I tell people the story where I was a very naive CTO for this Wall Street firm, and when Linux first came out, I tested all our database server, I tested our web server, and goes, oh my God, they all work. So I went to the board and said, hey, we could save millions. And the board goes, hey, Ray, you always tell us things break, right? I'm like, yeah. He goes, whose neck do we choke when that breaks? And I looked around, and I'm like, not mine, I'm not ready, right? So it wasn't until like Red Hat came with their Linux capability, and then I had backup. So you do have to be careful, but then you need orchestration capability to simplify, because this is just not a sustainable model moving forward, right? So it's important that we all talk about the nice technical pictures, and I used to be that type of CTO that I love drawing these architecture diagrams, but then as I started getting more into the executive role and presenting to board level, they would always say, Ray, where does the customer fit in here? Right? And I'm like, I didn't think about that, right? So these are the things moving forward that you need to go forward with. Now, if we look at, from an opportunity perspective, you know, a lot of people are claiming MEC, some might say mobile edge computing or multi-access edge computing. This is from one of my analysts, Paul Parker Johnson and Chris Nichols. They're saying it's about a $70 billion opportunity, which right away kind of caught me off guard. So I went back to them and said, unacceptable, I need the use cases for it. So they're in the process of building all the use cases to validate what's going to drive that market, right? And then the interesting thing is that if we look at traffic, right, from a trending perspective, right, what we see, there's a type, let's go into, so if we look at traffic moving to the edge, what we see, let me get out of the way here, is that a typical present mode of operation today, and this is just one example, there's a lot of things changing where we have a lot of the dedicated equipment here. And when we move into this cloud RAN environment, what you see is the application and the capability, but more important, a pulling of capacity and compute moving from the cell site into the data center. So there's some efficiencies of leveraging more hardware. And when we do the business cases for a lot of the carriers, this is the direction it goes forward with, right? So you need to prepare your edge, right? And then if we look at data from a cross-country perspective, this is actually reverse, is 2021, right? We see from Cisco's VNI, and when we cleanse some of the data, is we see that the data is projected to decline almost a double-digit number from now to 2021, right? And then if we look at data from a regional perspective, we see it just being somewhat flat and going up about 3%, which is minute. But the interesting thing is that if we look at the metro, right, from a metro perspective, we see that actually from a metro delivery point of view going from 22 to 35%. So data is getting into that, and these are the use cases to be able to validate that piece, right? So major opportunities, and there's a precursor to 5G. So I always say, let me go back to it, I always say that everything's changing, right? From an architecture point of view, but here's the thing that's not changing. Customer expectations aren't changing. They still have reliability, scalability, you know, and support going forward, right? So just because you move into this more agile environment doesn't mean the expectations change. Now there's some 5G observations that I put together so far based on us talking to a lot of the telcos or CSPs or whatever you guys want to call yourself, right? Because I was in a meeting I won't mention the service provider, but I mentioned the word telco. He goes, "We are not a telco." I'm like, "Sorry, my bad." Right? So anyway, what we see from an observation perspective is that it's about speed initially, right? We talked to about, oh God, it was close to 48 service providers around, and what we found out is that 21% are looking to increase ARPU, but a much larger number, almost 80%, are motivated by this low latency type environment, right? So it's an interesting number that it's about speed, right? The other observation is what we call a well-balanced approach, right, or offering, is that we see about 63% are looking to offer a combined enterprise service as well as consumer services, not just enterprise across the board in there. So that was kind of interesting about delivering the use case. But the part that I was a little concerned about is that, 5G, needs some type of IoT or machine-to-machine type use case, right? But M2M or IoT doesn't need 5G, right? And there's a lot of people LTE does a good job of delivering the service today. And I see a lot of people defining like robotic or certain manufacturing solutions as IoT. Those aren't IoT. Those are like enterprise computing type aspects of it. But LTE is doing a good job. So as you move forward to this, you really have to make sure you develop the proper use case. And then the last piece is that we see is that the business cases are somewhat lagging behind, right? Now in talking to a lot of people, they're like, yeah, we want to jump in 5G because we want to try to own the market first. And what we're seeing is there were a lot of lessons learned in 4G, meaning some made the mistake of not considering their mobile backhaul and the economic impact of mobile backhaul. So all those things that you learn from a 4G perspective, you have to implement going forward. But there's a lot of different entry points where you could either be second to market or third to market. It's just a matter of the use case and approach. So those are some of the business case that we're building for some of the telcos moving forward.